In the days before the Cataclysm, they say, there was peace. Scholars today look back and theorize that it was the proverbial calm before the storm, but at the time, nobody thought anything of it. It was a blessing, to be sure, but there was no reason to believe it to be preternatural. It is an odd thing how we fixate on something like that. The Cataclysm itself was so singular that anything which appears even tangentially related becomes a target of scrutiny almost automatically. I cannot pretend as if it has not occupied my mind as well. I may not remember the time before the Cataclysm, but still, it is a fixational concept. Paintings, songs, and even what official records still exist portray the days before the Cataclysm as perfectly pleasant, peaceful, an idealistic version of our world so far outside of what we understand now that it seems impossible to those of us who do not remember it. It is said that all wars happened to draw to a close in the days before, and that all the world's kingdoms attempted to work together in peaceful harmony. I don't believe it, frankly. It's not that I distrust the words of my elders, but I understand human nature too well to believe that there was a time when the world was so calm. My theory on the so-called peace is that people remember it as such only because the Cataclysm upturned everything to the extent that anything preceding it would seem peaceful by comparison. My teachers tell me not to voice my theory. It is sound advice. I ignore it. Chapter 1. Silver Eyes. I am Camorra Centrica, and yes, like those Centricas. It's always the first question anyone asks. No one believes my answer, but they ask anyways. It's alright, I don't really expect them to believe me right now. They will in time. I was born shortly after the Cataclysm. When I first say that, people tend to assume that I was born in the weeks after the Cataclysm, or even months. In actuality, I was born mere minutes after. Between that, my silver eyes, and the fact that she was not pregnant, my mother believed me to be a child of the Cataclysm from the moment I was born. She was probably correct in some sense, but it was far too early for what that meant to be known, and so I was raised almost normally. My mother did her best. She brought me the best teachers she could, and did everything she could to curtail my more problematic instincts. Don't blame her. She couldn't have done a better job. When the man with the insignia of the crown came, my mother knew there was nothing to be done. By that time, the nature of the children of the Cataclysm was known, and my mother knew me too well to believe I was an exception. I was given over to the care of the crown. The story would likely end there if the crown had been allowed to go through with its care. A child is too dangerous to leave alive, they say. Each must be tested, and each must then be dealt with. Fortunately, the Crown's agent, I never learned his name, I'm afraid, was ambushed during the return. That's how the Cataclysm seems to work these days. No more mass upheaval. Things are just tilted ever so slightly in the favor of its children in the hopes that we will survive. The bandits who killed the agent of the Crown took me in. Silver Eyes may frighten the common folk, but to them, I was an opportunity. The flap of the tent fluttered gently in a soft breeze. I thought it was odd that they had left me in an open tent, but I knew better than to test how free I really was. I could feel it somewhere inside me, that even if I presented an opportunity for them, if I were to try to leave, I would certainly be cut down. So I waited. The scent of something, a stew, perhaps, drifted through the air. It was glorious, meaty and warm in a way that momentarily made me think of home. I found myself at the tent's entrance almost instinctively, and had to force myself to step backwards. I couldn't. They would kill me without a thought. By the time I fully realized that I had left the tent, I was already there. I cursed myself inwardly as I looked up awkwardly at the group, awaiting the blow that would certainly end it all. What a stupid mistake. One of them, huge, lumbering, and scarred so heavily that it seemed almost as if no unmarred flesh remained, came to his feet. His voice, just as deep as he was huge and grumbling like an earthquake, confirmed my fears. "Idiot boy couldn't stay put." My blood ran cold. What had he said? I looked at him, icy and furious. The flat of a sword larger than myself slammed into the side of my head as I looked up, swung by the giant far faster than I could have predicted. The world went sideways, then upside down, then sideways again, and I landed in the dirt. I heard the assorted laughter of the rest of them from their seats at the fire. I shouldn't have left the tent. It was too late for that. He shouldn't have said that. The world turned silver for a moment. I breathed it in. Beautiful. And then I was moving, my hands and feet working in concert, driving me like an animal over the ground. The silver moment was still hanging in the air when I leapt, falling upon the giant like a wildling. My teeth found his throat as the silver moment left, and I felt him shift beneath me, moving to tear me off. I dug in, and his throat came with me. He stumbled, looking oddly shocked, one bear-like hand patting at the empty space where his throat used to be. His sword fell to the ground with a thunk. The others around the fire seemed stunned. I spat out a mess of blood and flesh, snarling, my eyes daring the others to make a move. It was a foolish dare. Even here, against one, I should have died but for that silver moment. Almost as one, in a wave of motion, they came to their feet, prepared to end me in the fashion I had been expecting since the tent. I braced myself, ready for what was to come. A hand fell onto my head. Shocked, I tried to leap away. Where had it come from? Whose hand was this? It anchored me in place, firmer and stronger than I could fathom. A voice like sweet music came from above and behind me, and at it the other bandits halted. Do not punish this child yet. She came looking for food after a long day, only to be called wrongly and threatened by a base brute. Would any of you do differently from her? The other bandits seemed to genuinely consider the question. It was odd. It seemed the sort of question which would be rhetorical, but only once each of them responded with a no did the hand release me, and that wonderful voice continue. If you would not act differently, then we will not punish her. With Titus having fallen, it would seem we have an open position, in fact. That same hand, gentle but strong, turned me. I gazed into the face of an angel, and my breath left me. He was shockingly, impossibly beautiful. To look directly at him seemed like staring into the sun, but how could I not stare? He was magnetic, perfect, beyond reason. And then he smiled, and I knew instantly I would cede to any request he made of me. How about it, girl? Will you join our merry fellowship? I stood in the middle of a well-worn path, shifting irritably from one foot to the other. They hadn't given me any Cataclysm-damned boots, and the path, for all the travel it evidently saw, was still covered in innumerable tiny pebbles that dug into my skin. Then I heard it. The sound of a horse and cart came from down the path. The trees still obscured it from view, so I checked myself over quickly. My clothes were perfectly ragged, with all the signs of having been worn for weeks while scrambling through underbrush and climbing trees. My pitch-black hair was stuck full of twigs. Garifor had laughed at that, knowing already how that part would annoy me, if only for how irritating it would be to clean up. I shot a glare in the direction of where he waited in the underbrush, and heard a muted chuckle. Taking a deep breath, I clutched one arm in the other hand, and began to stumble down the road in the direction the cart was coming from, dragging one leg behind me. The horse came into view first, and seemed ready to ignore me entirely, were it not for the driver, who glimpsed me in seconds and drew the horse to a stop. I smiled instinctively, then quickly quashed the expression and began to moan loudly. The driver called out to me. His voice was clear but wary in the way that a trained guard's would be when talking to an unknown beggar. "You there, boy! Are you all right? What has happened?" My blood, as ever it does, ran cold. I heard Garivor curse from the shrubbery behind me somewhere in the back of my mind, but at that point it was too late. I dropped the act, leaping towards the cart with a snarl twisting my face into a beastly mask. No silver moment gripped the world this time. I felt a sharp stone leave a cut in the sole of one of my feet as I charged the driver, but I was too deep to care. The driver startled into action within moments and kicked the cart into a stuttering start. I was saved from ruining the whole thing when a bolt the size of my arm tore through the air beside me and then through the neck of the horse, the force of the thing pulling the horse into its trajectory and dropping it onto its side. The cart teetered on two wheels, then followed after, and the startled cries of whoever was within brushed at the back of my mind. I fell on the driver, who was attempting to get to his feet from where the cart's fall had thrown him, my hands wrapping around his throat and my teeth bared inches from his face. My body shook with adrenaline, and in my fury I managed to keep that death grip on his neck, despite his larger arms attempting to push me off. My frenzy faded as his life did, and finally I pulled my hands away from him and stood shakily, looking back towards the cart. The hand was standing around it, apart from Garivor, who sat atop the thing, holding the door shut beneath him. Lek shook his head at me, and I grimaced. I had nearly ruined the whole operation, and I knew it. I locked my eyes on my feet and wrapped my arms around myself, turning slightly away. Neleus laughed. It was musical and energetic, as beautiful as everything about the man, and the rest of the hand could not help but to join in. Even I smiled a bit. Lek was the only one to seem unfazed, but you could never tell with wildlings, even the civilized ones. Neleus hopped up atop the cart with Garivor, offered the reedy man his hand, and pulled him to his feet. Garivor was several heads taller than Neleus, but the mere presence of Neleus still made the taller man look small, and Garivor's body, which would be whip-thin under any context, looked positively frail beside the leader of the Silver Hand. Garivor backed off the door and fell into a crouch on the edge of the cart. Neleus looked around at the hand's scattered members, nodded some affirmation to himself, and tore open the door of the cart. A man dressed in the Crown's bizarre clothing, 2 layers of long-sleeved shirt and some odd, pointless neck adornment even in the summer months. The fashion was odd and almost alien. Scrambled up over the door, to the laughter of some of the members of the hand, only for Neleus to grab onto the collar of his clothing and yank him to a halt. A blonde-haired woman, practically old by the assessment of my young eyes, but probably only in her 30s or so, in a similarly odd dress, did not follow the man's example, but simply stood to her feet, apparently stunned and confused. Garivor waved to her, a grin which was 2 parts amused and 1 part cruel splitting his face, then hopped through the open doors, pushed her to the side, and began to fumble around the inside of the cart. The woman stumbled at his push, tears beginning to drip down her face, but she still did not attempt to leave, a glance spared for Neleus, betraying her fear for our leader's intentions. Garivor let out a shout of triumph and lifted a wooden chest inlaid with gilting and the symbol of the crown above his head, to raucous cheers from the rest of the hand. Garivor placed the chest atop the cart, then pushed himself up after it. Neleus, still holding the man with 1 hand, gestured for one of the others to hold him. The nearest man did, and Neleus turned from the man and offered his hand to the woman in the cart. In his melodic voice, kept low and soft as if to avoid frightening her further, he spoke to her. "Lady, we bear no ill will towards you. If you will, please step out of the cart." The woman, as everyone is, seemed struck by Neleus. Dreamily, she placed her hand in his, and he helped her out of the cart and down onto the road. Neleus nodded to her with a smile, then put his other hand to his mouth and whistled. Garivor hopped off the cart, chest in his arms, and the rest of the hand gathered on one side and pushed the cart back onto its wheels. Those on the side which it had fallen on seemed a bit worse for wear, but all in all, the cart had held up remarkably well, apart from a branch sticking through its window. Neleus directed the man and woman both to get back into the cart. He smiled at them as they acquiesced, closed the door behind them, and pressed the hilt of his sword, still sheathed, to the door. I saw his lips move, although at the distance I still stood at, I couldn't hear whatever it was he muttered. A flash of light made me curse a little for watching like I did, and when I turned back, the doors of the cart were sealed shut by glowing chains. It wasn't the first time I had seen magic, of course. The bolt which had saved this outing from my mistake had been magically enhanced, if I understood Lex's explanation correctly, and my mother had made sure I had seen several examples of the craft. But Neleus's magic was just more. I couldn't explain it, and I don't mean that I didn't know enough to attempt. No child of the Cataclysm would ever be able to construct an understanding of magic, not that deeply. I could know the basics of its function, and I could know that some people were more skilled with it than others, but I could never hope to understand why. The deeper knowledge required would never stick in our minds. While I was pondering, Garivor was walking over to me, the chest still cradled in his arms. His voice was the kind of voice that makes you expect everything he says to be a lie on some instinctive level, but it would be an unfair assessment to make. The reedy man was certainly impish, and prone to jokes even I, at the oh-so-mature age of 12, often found childish, but he rarely lied in the truest sense, and when he did, it was generally to protect your feelings. He spoke in the kind of half-whisper that is meant less to hide what you're saying, and more to make a joke out of a false conspiratorial nature. "You know, girl, if this keeps happening, we might have a problem." I flushed deeply as the nearer members of the Hand chuckled. I didn't know them too well yet, but I already felt a faint kinship, and even if I didn't, being laughed at is rarely pleasant. I kicked Garivor in the shin and stalked off, the Hand's chuckles turning into full-on laughter as Garivor hopped on one leg comically, letting out a similarly comical howl of false pain that made me struggle to keep from breaking my angry expression for a smile. Neleus clapped a firm hand onto my head again, and gave me a cheery smile. "Don't worry about it, Kem. We handled it. We'll keep handling it," he said, perfect voice so purely genuine that I couldn't fend off the smile any longer. Neleus ruffled my hair and walked off towards Garivor, the rest of the Hand trailing after him, more like the sea trailing after a boat in motion than any intentional movement. The chest had been filled with silver coins, pulled from the mines captured during the Silver Wars, which I would later learn had spawned the Silver Hand. Neleus, whose plans were always larger than the Hand could fathom, spread only a fraction of the take among the men. The Hand, who knew that his plans were greater than what they saw, did not complain. Each member of the Hand received equal shares, and to my shock, so did I. It was a simple gesture, and in retrospect I really shouldn't have been surprised. I may have been the bait, but they had been treating me like one of them for days before we attacked the cart. Nevertheless, when they gave me a portion of the silver equal to any of them, I stopped feeling as if I were a girl they were tolerating, and started feeling like I was truly a member of the Silver Hand. In the months which followed, my relationship with the other members of the Hand progressed. I learned there were always 6 members of the Hand, 1 for each finger, and Neleus representing the palm. I learned of the Silver Wars and the atrocities wrought by the Crown against a small silver mining town which 3 members of the Hand, Neleus, Garivor, and Ryota, hailed from. And most importantly, I began to learn their ways. As it started out, I learned their tactics and methods. It was strategy, in a way, but not in the stuffy sense that the teachers my mother had arranged imparted to me in discussions of old wars, but rather in an active, exciting way which enthralled me. I was brilliant at it. I don't mean that I was pretty good, or that I was good for my age. I mean that I was, and still am, in fact, brilliant. At the end of the first month, Neleus began involving me in the planning of our work, and I couldn't have been prouder. At the end of the third, Neleus left the planning to me. For all my brilliance in the flow of an attack and the strategy of the highwayman, I was still 12 years old, and a child of the Cataclysm. Metka and Garivor began to teach me the blade and spear, and while I grasped the theory rapidly, my tiny body could not hope to perform it effectively. I was given a dagger after a larger raid so that I could attempt to fend for myself beyond what I could do with tooth and nail, but nobody expected me to be able to seriously contribute in a fight, least of all me. Ryota reluctantly taught me a bit of bowcraft, but I didn't take to it nearly as well, and she eventually deemed my performance a lost cause. Neleus, ignoring my silver eyes, attempted to teach me magic. I grasped the idea of it, but, true to my nature as a child, could never so much as summon up a spark. I still devoured as much understanding as I could. Neleus is a brilliant teacher, and his voice always had that quality which drew you back into it over and over. As he taught it, magic is a form of maths. Each spell is a formula which must first be constructed towards the desired outcome, then solved. A solved magical equation can then be stored, whether it be in a gemstone, a piece of paper, or some other object, and then deployed from the object. That much I could understand. That is where it slipped away from me. The maths of magic are impossible, twisting and unreal, the numbers dancing and shifting about before being drawn into a spell, and changing inexplicably while one attempts to solve the equation. Neleus explained all this, and attempted to teach me how the mage must come at the problem. No matter what he did or said, however, it would never quite work for me. I became frustrated with magic very quickly. Lek was a different story from the rest of the hand, which was not really a surprise. Wildlings were near impossible to read on the best of the days, and the hand, for all my tactical brilliance and Neleus's outstanding leadership, had many bad days. Lek was never mean, and rarely seemed angry, but he never seemed happy either. He did not attempt to teach me anything, and I never asked him to. Eventually, I would learn how to work with him a bit better, but we never became family in the way that I felt the rest of the hand and I did. By the time I reached my 13th birthday, I had nearly forgotten my mother's home. The hand's camp was small but distinctly cozy, and I had a tent to myself and a bedroll I had swiped from a merchant caravan, and a small collection of weapons and other trophies from our various successful attacks. By the time I reached my 14th birthday, my mother's home was a distant memory. The hand's membership had stayed stable for a year and a half by my reckoning, and Neleus said that it was the longest the membership had gone without some change. I was proud of that, endlessly so, feeling that my contributions in strategy had certainly gone some distance to preserving our lives. I had grown a bit, too, and the constant involvement in battles and the continued training from the other members of the hand meant that I was decent in a fight, even against adults.